Alrighty, good morning everybody. This morning Labor's releasing our fully costed and independently verified fiscal plan. It contains our election policies and it indicates how they fit within the updated pre-election fiscal update spending allowances. Budget 2023 and the pre-election fiscal update provide the costings for the government's existing work program over the forecast period. So what we're looking at today, as I indicated yesterday, are the costings for the policies that we've announced during the election campaign. And this announcement today confirms that those will all fit within the spending allowances identified. We're doing this on the day that overseas voting opens. We believe that New Zealanders here and around the world should be able to verify what each party is offering and that their plan stacks up and that what they spend can be met with the revenue that they're intending to raise. It's now commonly accepted that National's tax plan doesn't add up, and that's evidenced by the News Hub poll last night, which shows New Zealanders don't believe that it does. That they simply cannot raise the amount required to fund their tax cuts is now clearly evident. We know that means bigger cuts to public services, and in fact, Christopher Luxon's promising to proceed with tax cuts, even if he cannot identify how he's going to pay for them. That can only mean one thing: bigger and deeper cuts to our public services. As you'll see in the fiscal plan that we're setting out today, the economic situation facing the next government is going to be tight, and we have responded to that in the commitments that we have been making. Cost pressures do eat up a large chunk of spending before new spending or any reductions in revenue like tax cuts would be accounted for. So losing billions of dollars in revenue from the plan would invariably mean cuts to things like health and education. There is simply no other way they could be funded. And cuts include not adequately funding cost pressures, and that will mean those areas like health and education end up with less. I'm really proud of Labor's strong track record of fiscal management in government. A huge amount of credit for how the economy has performed and for how New Zealand's government's books are looking now, some of the best in the world, I might add, goes to the man standing beside me today, Grant Robertson. Grant has run two surpluses in the years before COVID-19. They were $5.5 billion and $7.4 billion. That's larger than any surplus delivered under the previous national government. In fact, these surpluses are higher than the target that Bill English had set for himself but had never managed to achieve in the 9 years that National was in government. We've also brought our debt down so that it is net debt is in a world-leading position. We did that before COVID-19. We brought our debt well below target, which meant that we were in a position to support New Zealanders as we headed into the global pandemic. And during and since then, Grant's economic management has helped to save lives and livelihoods. It's helped to support businesses to stay afloat, and it's allowed us to invest in the recovery so that we can continue to grow. We used the strong balance sheet that we had going into the pandemic to support workers and businesses during some hard times. Our economy is now nearly 8% larger than it was before COVID-19. Unemployment has been below 4% for 2 years. In the last quarter, our economy grew faster than the likes of Australia, the UK, the US, and the European Union. That's somewhat at odds to some of the claims that you will have seen on billboards around the country. And while inflation remains too high, it's coming down and will be back in the Reserve Bank's target range next year. Now is not the time for a radical change in direction. Steady, consistent, and balanced economic management is what the country needs right now. Where we invest, it needs to be to support those who need it the most. It needs to be targeted to avoid a spike in inflation. And it needs to address child poverty, our climate emissions, and the range of pressing issues that the country is going to continue to face in the next term. Labor's plan does all of those things. We've got New Zealand through all of our recent challenges with a plan that sets out a path back to surplus, with record investment in infrastructure and record investments in health and education. And again, I want to compliment Grant for his discipline here, some of the lowest debt in the developed world. Grant, I want to acknowledge your track record as our Minister of Finance and also say to you, bring on Budget 2024. I'll hand over to Grant.
Thank you, Chris. Ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. As Chris has said, our fiscal plan has a relatively simple job to do: ensure that the commitments that we've made in the election campaign fit within the fiscal parameters of pre-fu forecasts and projections. As the government, our work plan for the next few years was outlined at Budget 2023. This was then updated at pre-fu, including pre-budget commitments. They represent the fiscal plan and strategy for Labour. This showed that we had met our fiscal rules of getting to surplus in the forecast period and having net debt below 30% of GDP. Obviously, we are not in the business of second-guessing Treasury's assumptions that they made at pre-fu, so the focus is on the commitments that we have made in the election campaign. As in previous years, we have had these costings independently assessed, and Infometrics, who have done that work for us this time, have concluded in the material that has been released to you that our commitments can fit within the available budget allowances. As the Prime Minister has said, Labour has consistently taken a balanced and careful approach to budgets over the 6 years that we have been in office. The pendulum swing between good times and bads for the global economy during these years has been like none other seen in New Zealand's history. And so each budget that we have delivered has had to be different. It's had to be appropriate for the situation that we faced at the time, and it's had to be able to change as conditions have changed. And I am proud of every one of the budgets we have produced. I think back to just the start of this year. We had set the indicative budget allowance track back in December, and we were tracking nicely to be within that. And then New Zealand experienced the second largest natural disaster it's ever had, and it hit this city in Auckland and this in the North Island more widely. Now, we could have ignored the immediate need for a surge in investment to help businesses to get through, for silt removal, for rebuilding schools and hospitals affected by the flooding. We could have said, we've set the allowance already, please come back next year. But of course we didn't do that. We used our strong position to be nimble and able to adapt and respond to what was in front of us. New Zealand is one of a handful of countries to have had our credit rating upgraded during COVID. That's because despite the extra investment, like the more than $20 billion that went into the wage subsidy scheme and the billions of dollars that went into the health response or for support for sectors like tourism or regional development, the rating upgrades occurred because we were consistently recording lower debt than the countries we compare ourselves against. It's also because we protected our economy during COVID, so that when things started up again, according to the IMF last month, New Zealand grew faster out of the depths of COVID than Australia, the US, the EU and the UK, up 10.2% from June 2020 versus Australia at 8.8%. And while others catch up, we're now able to go through a period where we do focus on bringing inflation back down, while making sure we can prioritise the investments in areas that Kiwis care about the most, like health, housing and education. And that's what this fiscal plan does. Our priorities as a government under Chris Hipkins' leadership mean that we're focusing our election commitments at targeted cost of living support, at building a stronger health sector, at addressing climate change and becoming more productive and growing the economy so that Kiwis can earn higher wages. The fiscal plan shows how our spending commitments fit within the existing budget parameters. I just want to touch on a few important areas before we take your questions. You'll see that we've incorporated the Treasury's projection published in the pre-fu for how much our health system will need to cover additional cost pressures across each of the next three budgets as we move to a 3-year health budget process from Budget 2024. This will see $14 billion invested in our health system through to 27-28. Setting these budgets up front allows the health sector to plan ahead, knowing just what they will be getting. On top of this, we're prioritising new investments to improve Kiwis' access to healthcare, such as the additional funding for Pharmac, the $1 billion over the forecast period, and training more doctors and dentists. Now, these are significant commitments, but the reality is that anything less than this will mean our health system will go backwards and fail to meet the vital investments we need. As indicated in pre-fu, there have been a number of pre-commitments on future budget allowances. We've outlined these in our plan. It's worth noting that this includes multi-year funding that we have set aside for our justice and natural resources clusters. This means additional funding for agencies like police, justice, environment and conservation. Beyond these pre-commitments and health cost pressures, we have carefully set aside an appropriate pot of money in each year to deal with other cost pressures that the government faces in areas such as education. At Budget 2023, cost pressures accounted for 79% of all new spending in the budget, and we've ensured that that ratio is able to stay about the same across each of the 3 budgets next term. As I indicated at Budget 2023, and have reiterated many times since, including at Pre-Fu, Budget 2024 in particular will be one that will need to show restraint. We have already shown our commitment to this with the savings that we announced at Pre-Fu. There is sufficient funding to meet cost pressures in areas such as education, but a disciplined approach is required. Our careful management of the books means we can incorporate the operating costs of the 6,000 additional public houses we've committed to beyond 2025, while the capital contribution can be well afforded within the multi-year capital allowance, which is set to expand by $7 billion a year at each budget, a number already built into Treasury's projections. Now, funding cost pressures is not sexy stuff, but it's the stuff that governments have to do. You can't just close your eyes and hope that the health system will keep itself running, or that classrooms will fix themselves. You have to put the money aside, and that's what this fiscal plan does. We can afford these priorities as a country because of a strong underlying economy and a strong set of government books. According to the IMF's consistent net debt measure, New Zealand at about 23% compares favourably against Australia at around 35%, the US and the UK each above 90% net debt to GDP. As I've mentioned, we've had our credit ratings upgraded during COVID and reaffirmed in recent weeks because of our strong position against the rest of the world. As the Prime Minister's noted, our unemployment rate has been below 4% for 2 years, meaning that Kiwis are facing the global cost of living spike while in work. In the year to June, there were 69,000 more Kiwis in work than the Treasury had forecast in the May budget. And over time, our time in office, wages have grown stronger than inflation, and this is forecast to continue. We can use our strength to keep making Kiwis' lives better. The plan is presented without the need for drastic cuts to the services that Kiwis rely on every day. It doesn't rely on ghost buyers of homes that don't exist. It doesn't require selling $5 billion of prime Kiwi property to foreigners every year, year on year. It doesn't require asset sales or Kiwis gambling 4 times more like our opponents are having to rely on. I believe that it is a careful and balanced plan that will make New Zealand a better place, but to make it happen, it requires a party vote for Labour.
Thank you, Grant. I think you're the only person I have ever heard who has used the term cost pressures and sexy stuff in the same sentence.
What finance ministers do.
We'll now open up for questions.
Just in terms of your operating allowance, I mean, it's been pointed out by Nicola Willis a number of times on the campaign trail so far that every single budget so far, or almost all of them, you've had to go over and above that. Can you commit today to keeping to those operating allowances?
I'm going to let Grant speak on that, but I want to speak on that for a moment too. We've faced some of the most unprecedented challenges that any government in New Zealand's history has faced, and as Grant has already acknowledged, we haven't simply turned our back on them and said, sorry, we've set a fixed budget, we're not going to help you out because of the cyclone or because of the flooding or because of COVID-19. And I would note that the National Party regularly also exceeded the spending allowances that they had set themselves when they were last in government.
Yeah, and that's really the point that I was about to make. 3 times under Bill English and Stephen Joyce, they went beyond the budget allowances that had been set for them at the budget policy statement. As I said before, that is what we are working towards. We've shown our commitment to that already with the $4 billion of savings on top of the $4 billion of savings that we had at Budget 2023. So I'm committing to these today, but I also am not committing to ignoring an event that might occur between now and then. So budget allowances are an important guide for putting a budget together. But I'd also say in the years in which we did end up with a higher budget allowance than what we had set at the half-yearly update or the budget policy statement, we more often than not ended up with debt lower than had been expected then, or with unemployment lower than had been expected then. Those allowances are a means to an end of achieving the overall goals we've set.
And just on the cost pressures side, you said, and we knew that it was 79% of the last budget was for funding cost pressures, and I think today you said it will be
close to that. Yeah, 77, I think it is.
And you said that over the next forecast period, it's likely to be the same. Does that not make a good argument for why there should be cuts within the government sector? I mean, 79% around about that going forward. It's a big number.
It is, but those, as I said before, this is the bread and butter of government, and actually not funding those cost pressures leads to significant cuts in services. It's what governments have to do. We have asked our agencies to be more effective and more efficient. We actually set up the Fiscal Sustainability and Effectiveness Program in May, and that has identified where we can find some immediate savings, and now we've also asked for those 1 to 2% savings from here. So we absolutely want government agencies to be more effective and more efficient, but actually funding cost pressures is what governments are here to do.
Given how tight the operating allowance is, what happens when there's more natural disasters, another pandemic, something else that comes along? You don't have any money there. What are you going to do?
Oh, well, we deal with that by using our balance sheet, which is exactly what we've done in the past. The point I'm making there is more that these are the allowances that have been set out. They're the allowances we're committed to. But I'm also not going to stand here and say it will never change, because you deal with that. We deal with that by making use of the balance sheet we have, and our level of net debt is low relative to the rest of the world, and so it means we've got headroom. The target we've set ourselves, the fiscal rule, is that 30% level. We're expected to peak at 22. We're at 18 at the moment. So we're well away from that cap. So we can manage the unexpected because of the careful management we've got.
But there's been a lot of talk of fiscal holes. Are you 100% sure there is no fiscal hole in this plan?
Absolutely, and it's important to remember what this plan is. We've been the government. We laid out our plan for the next few years in May at the budget. Had a whole lot of interesting and exciting new initiatives, as well as the cost pressures in it. All our fiscal plan is doing is saying, here are the extra commitments we've made post-pre-FU. They fit in within the allowances. So that's the job of that. If people want to poke holes in the Treasury's work, that's a whole different matter, which we could discuss, but it's not what we're trying to do today.
Yes, you touched on this on your speech, but what do you make of the fact that the Nats have failed to release their fiscal plan ahead of voting starting, despite promising to?
The National Party promised that they were going to set out their fiscal plan before voting started. Voting starts today, they still haven't set out their fiscal plan. There's one reason for that. They can't make their numbers add up. Everybody knows they can't make their numbers add up.
And just to go back to Katie's point, so would it not make sense to build more of a buffer zone, given that we are probably going to be seeing climate disasters every year, be they fires or droughts or floods or cyclones?
Well, my comment would be that the need for fiscal discipline, which is what our plan shows, actually is informed by the fact that we could see other further unexpected events. It's the reason why we've been focused on keeping our net debt low compared to the rest of the world. We look across the Tasman, for example, net debt's roughly double, I think, what it is in New Zealand. In the US, the UK, it's at 100% of GDP almost. You know, New Zealand's net debt is actually very low by international standards.
Could I just add to that too, that I think part of the thing here is focusing on the allowance per se. The allowance is what we've set ourselves. The way that we create the extra fiscal space is through the balance sheet, through the debt track. And so as long as we keep that under control, if we did have another event, we would deal with that. The second thing I would say is a much underrated element of Budget 2023 was the National Resilience Plan, which is exactly the point that you're getting at, Amelia, which is that we do need to get ahead of where we are. So we put that money aside in order to be able to say, this country has got enormous challenges coming at it from climate change. We need a plan that gets us ahead. Now, we were developing that idea, and then the Auckland Anniversary Weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle hit. And so the initial focus of that plan is now making those communities more resilient, dealing with adaptation issues. But there is more funding over the forecast period to try to start getting ahead.
You've also got
Glenn.
660 million of leeway in the next year. If there's something else that happens, you're going to have to borrow, right? Like, this is almost... Correct. But again, the budget allowances are the envelope of funding that we're working to put our budget together. It's important to remember that that 660 adds to $2.7 billion that we've set aside for cost pressures. So that's, you know, all of the health pressures are counted, all of the pressures in police, justice, environment,
They're all counted already. So the 660 covers off areas like education. And if you look at last year's budget, there was about $150 million of new spending per annum for education. So there's plenty of room within the 660 to do that. As the former Minister of Education will tell you, the big cost in the education area is salaries, and we've dealt with that. There's a pre-commitment here in the numbers in front of you for that. So it will be tight, absolutely, but we've provisioned for the big cost pressures the government will face.
So we have cost pressures that you discussed, of 70% of the allowances going forward on cost pressures. Are most of the cost pressures met from the pre-commitments? Because it seems like the pre-commitments...
Yes,
are only
the short answer is that, that is yes, Thomas.
And so the other sectors, sort of other parts of education that are not salaries, defence, et cetera.
That's what comes from the 660, right. That's correct. But as I said in the answer I've just given to Glenn, that if you look at education, the big burden there is salaries, and we've dealt with that. It was about 150 million per annum from here. There's room.
Right, so you think that everything that's not the pre-commitments can be managed within that 6?
It will be, and that is the work we're doing. Now, that will require significant discipline, and this reminds me a bit of Budget 2018 when we came in. We had a number of pre-commitments in those days because we're in opposition. It was called the 100-day plan. We did all of those things, and then when we sat down to do Budget 2018, many of my conversations with my colleagues were extremely short because I said, well, we've done that there. That will be a similar situation for B24 because we have $2.7 billion, a lot of money, going into health and those other areas I've just mentioned, and an envelope of money for the rest of what we need to do.
So why did you choose Infometrics to look at this?
A reputable agency that we chose. My recollection is we used them last time as well, and so we did that again.
They haven't looked at the individual costings of your policy?
Some of them they have, if you ever look at that, but no, I mean they've well, I'm not going to speak for the words in the report, but they've gone through and they've tested the assumptions in some areas, said that they're credible and believe that overall the underlying assumptions are credible. When we put out each individual policy, we did say how it was being paid for.
So they have to trust your assumptions, though?
Well, I think that's what all agencies do, but they did test some of the assumptions if you have a look at the document.
Can I just, I want to make a quick comment on that. Where every policy that we've announced, we've released a fact sheet which includes the assumptions we've made around our costings. Now, people might disagree with some of the policies, like removing GST off fruit and vegetables. They might disagree whether or not that's a good idea. They're not disagreeing with the costings. So those tax experts and those economists who are saying we don't agree with the policy, they're not saying that numbers don't add up. They agree that the numbers add up.
They actually are saying that, though, the Taxpayers
Yeah,
Union.
well,
The Taxpayers Union is a National Party front
people.
group. We're talking about credible sources.
The National Party could say the same to you about the CTU and their costings of when they do that. And so they say
Sure, they could.
there's
And they do,
hundreds
regularly.
of millions of dollars missing from your
But there's
GST.
simply
It's
not.
And the Taxpayers Union have actually made a mistake in that as well. We've already banked the savings that people make. So when people get their GST off their fruit and vegetables, we've assumed that 100% of the savings they get from that are going to be spent on more fruit and vegetables. If they spend that on something else, actually our costings are overly conservative because they'll pay GST on the other stuff they're spending it on. The Taxpayers Union beat up is just fictional. It doesn't make sense. They haven't actually got their numbers right.
And can I just ask, on the ETS, so with petrol looking like it's going to get hit $3.50 by Christmas, would you likely intervene in that pricing again to make it more affordable?
One of the reasons we're committed to things like government investment and decarbonising industry, GIDI, and other initiatives that are designed to bring our emissions down is it does help to offset the increase in household costs caused by a rising price of carbon. The National Party and the ACT Party have said they want the ETS to do all the heavy lifting when it comes to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. That would mean at least 40 cents a litre more on petrol. They should be upfront with New Zealanders about that. Any benefit that they might get from things like tax cuts will be taken away by the fact that they're going to pay more every time they fill up their car because they're going to let the price of carbon go up significantly more than it would under us.
But if we look at what's going to happen right before Christmas, right? So low-income families who have cars
Understand,
which are
right?
gas guzzlers are really going to be struggling here. A lot of them, say care workers, need to pay for their own petrol to get between jobs. So, you know, if you're getting a couple of cents off fruit and vegetables from April next year, how is that going to help you when you suddenly see 50 cents?
Look, I understand the point that you're raising, Amelia, and we spent close to $2 billion supporting New Zealanders as the cost of fuel spiked and the global inflation crisis spiked. We are not going to do that again, to answer your question that you asked. I appreciate the challenges that are there. If you look overall at the cost of living package that we put out, including lifts to things like working for families, including support for public transport so that it stays half price for people under the age of 25, those sorts of initiatives are there to help with the cost of living. But the scale of intervention that we did is not possible at the moment, and we won't be doing it.
Just on your...
just on the, I mean, I guess, you know, we compare ourselves to a lot of other countries, but we're also more centralised in those countries. So New Zealand is, you know, central government is on the hook for a lot more costs related to big disasters. So don't we need to either, if the balance sheet is our backup plan, don't we need to be paying down debt faster? Or by reprioritising spending that way, or doing something else?
Two answers to that, but the first of those is the point I made before about the National Resilience Plan. So actually, we thought about this and we realised that our adaptation challenges as a country are more significant and more pressing than many others, and so that's why we put that fund in place. Secondly, just to reiterate, our balance sheet is in a position to deal with another external shock and still meet the fiscal rules that we've put in place. Historically, New Zealand governments have attempted to keep our level of debt low. We too are attempting to do that, but we also recognise we've got to get ahead of some of the big infrastructure and adaptation challenges. It's all about balance, and when we're sitting with a net debt level of about 18%, we're in a strong position to deal with what might come along.
Just what you're saying about fiscal responsibility. Oh, sorry, did you have a follow-up?
No.
Just in terms
So
of...
polite,
I am a
Jason.
polite guy.
Have you got your microphone back, by the way?
Just in terms of what you're saying about the fiscal responsibility rules, and I might be mistaken, so correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see anything in there about you having a government spending as a proportion to GDP target.
So everything that's in pre-FU is the Labor government's fiscal strategy and plan. So that gets us down to 31.5% by the end of the forecast period.
You previously committed to 30%. Are you...
We've committed to getting back towards the long-term average, which is 30%, so 31.5. It's in the ballpark. But again, if you don't fund the core things government needs to do, if you slavishly said it has to be exactly 30%, that will mean deeper cuts to public services. It's about a balance. I think that's in the ballpark of where we need to be.
Is in the ballpark good enough, though? I mean,
Yes, it is.
I understand what
What's
you're
not good enough, Jason, would be underfunding health or underfunding
It
education.
doesn't have to come from health or education. Surely you can find some fat in the system.
Which we are. And that's how, bear in mind our level of expenses are slightly higher than that at the moment. And so we're on a trajectory down there. And part of the way we're doing that is asking government agencies to be more effective and efficient. Hence the 1 to 2% savings that we've asked for.
Is it a case of, you know, superannuation slowly rising, health costs of an ageing population slowly rising? Is it a case that potentially over the next decade New Zealand just gets used to slightly above 30% of GDP as the level of stable full crown spending rather than slightly below 30% of GDP, which was last year?
And I think you make a good point here, Thomas, that we ended up towards the end of the national government in the 27, 28%. I would argue that that wasn't sufficient to fund the quality public services New Zealand need. Now, we're not talking about huge differences here, but being up at that 31 area is a good place to be. Of course, I'd like to see it come down a little bit further from there, but I've got to balance that against what New Zealanders need to be able to live their lives. Katie.
Consumer confidence remains really low. People are still feeling very down about where the economy is, about where their own financial situation is. Why should they really have faith in you standing here saying this? They just look at a fiscal plan, doesn't make sense. What does it mean for them every day at home?
What it means for them is we've got their back. And we've had their back all the way through the challenges of the last few years, and we're going to carry on with that. It means that we're investing in the things that they need, the health system, the education system, making sure that there's good quality housing available. I appreciate the fact that the fiscal plan's numbers, we have to produce this to be able to show you that what we're promising fits within what's there. But where New Zealanders are at the moment is that we're in an economy where we've had huge challenges, and I appreciate at a household level it's been really, really difficult. there is light at the end of the tunnel. We have turned the corner. We are now seeing economic growth. Interestingly, in the most recent business confidence surveys, that is turning around. And I think consumers, as inflation starts to come down more, will feel more confident. But they're expressing their views about the situation we've had.
What do you enjoy about being finance minister?
I love numbers. No, what I enjoy about being finance minister is the fact that it's a role where you get to support and enable my colleagues and the Prime Minister to be able to take New Zealand in a really positive direction. I've said for a long time, the economy is not an end in itself. It's the means to the end of creating the society we want. It's not an easy job. It's a job where you have to say no a lot to people, but it is a role which I think, and all modesty aside, if I can quote the Prime Minister, it's one where I've taken a pretty careful and balanced approach over the last few years, and that's what this plan does in the future.
Will you stay on in the finance role and in Parliament?
It's up to him if I get to still be the Finance Minister.
Do you want to still stay?
Absolutely.
Even though it's opposition.
I'm not even contemplating that, Katie. If that were to occur, I'd make that decision.
The Prime Minister obviously had some very kind words about your...
Well, perhaps you'd like to say some more.
I'm happy to elaborate.
I'm sure you'd like to, but the opposition has been less than charitable and said that you're, quote, the worst finance minister of all time. What have you got to say about that?
Well, I'll let the judgment be made by independent people rather than my opposition. And if you take a look at what the ratings agencies have consistently said, they've backed what we're doing. We were one of a handful of countries who had our credit rating upgraded during COVID. So politics is politics. People will say what they like, but I think the independent assessments of the work that we've done have been good.
To be honest, I don't think that the people who can't even make the most basic numbers add up are in any kind of position to criticise the financial track record of Grant Robertson and this government.
Do you think that New Zealanders trust you as Finance Minister?
They have every reason to trust us. We have managed New Zealand's economy responsibly through some of the most difficult and challenging circumstances the country has seen in any of our lifetimes.
This taking new commitments, can I talk about the GST policy? It is so expensive, 2.2 billion. When you look at every other commitment, most of them are under billion. You could, build thousands of new state houses. You could hire hundreds of extra police officers. Why is that a good use of money?
It is a change that is going to make a practical difference. It sits within the 10-point cost of living plan that we have set out. I have been to the I do my own supermarket shopping, and I have seen families walking through the fruit and veggie aisle without buying anything because they can't afford it. This will make a practical difference to them.
The capital allowance is quite large. Are you at all concerned about the capacity pressures in delivering on that spending and I guess if National were looking to make some numbers add up, it would be an obvious place to look to fill it. What would that look like?
Yeah, I guess the challenge for the National Party would be if they were to take that approach, what of our critical infrastructure needs are not going to be met? Are they not going to build state houses? Well, actually, at the moment, they're committed to stopping building them from 2025. Are they not going to invest in our hospitals or our schools? So each budget, the way it works is that's the money that's effectively set aside via Treasury's fiscal strategy model. Then at each budget, we have a little bit of debate, and one of the debates we have is about capacity. And so we try to make sure that we match that up. We've had really good delivery of things like education capital spending, defence capital spending. So we've been able to make that work. But that's the starting point for the conversation at each budget.
Are you confident $7 billion a year you can solidly deliver on that?
We have to be, because New Zealand's got an infrastructure deficit.
Question just about the health cost pressure funding. That's Te Whātua and Treasury have worked out that number as that's what it takes to keep the lights on, right? So, National's fiscal plan is apparently coming in the next couple of days.
Oh, good. Is it?
This morning. So if the number is lower than that, that's
the point that I made when I spoke was that is, as you say, I think it's page 50-something of the pre-fu, has that number in it. It is the assessment that's been made, and it's what we're committing to today, and then we're adding to that with the other health commitments that we've made. Anybody who thinks that they can fund the health system for less than that is going to be on a very steep, slippery slope. I have to say, it's exactly what we inherited. So we used to have a debate about whether health spending had gone up every year under the previous national government. That wasn't the right debate. The debate was it getting even close to meeting the effective line that was drawn in the pre-fu? It didn't, and it meant that we underfunded the health system for what it needed for years. We've put extraordinary sums of money into the health system over the last few years, and it is the reality that we have to keep putting money at this level in. So yes, one of the tests for the National Party's fiscal plan will be, have they put enough money in for health?
Can you explain your assumptions around the ETS revenue and why that's, will you have enough money to surplus for your promises?
Oh, absolutely, we will. And you will have seen in the calculations there, we've added in the extra year, which is what would happen when we come to a new budget. And I think it's 1.48 billion or something like that. And we've left a buffer in there, so there is a buffer. We're very confident about that. The carbon price has been sitting around $60, and we're confident that we can make the assumption that that's the amount of money that's coming in. And we've laid out the commitments we've made that are costs against the surf, and there's a bit of money left over.
So you don't think that ETS revenues will decline?
No, I don't. In fact, they did, and now they've come back.
Just a question on tax. Jacinda Ardern committed to no new taxes last term. Is that Labor's commitment again for next term?
We've set out our tax plan. We set it out some months ago, which makes it clear what taxes we would and wouldn't consider in the next term of Parliament. So there are some areas, for example, the digital services tax, where we've been really clear that is on the table. That is something that we're going to progress with. But things like a capital gains tax and a wealth tax are not.
But over and above the things that are being published today in the fiscal plan, nothing in addition to that?
We have no additional plans there. We have said, there are things in there where we've said, there are fees and levies, for example, which government adjusts regularly. We'll continue to do that as every other government has, but we don't intend to introduce significant, new taxes or levies.
Who's to say what significant is? I mean, that's
Well,
leaving a lot of gap.
we've given people an indication in our plan of what that looks like.
Is Labour relying on the digital services tax in any of this plan?
Yes, we are. It's baked in, but it was baked in at pre-fu, so we're not changing what pre-fu did with that.
Do you know when it will actually kick in?
So two ways that it'll kick in. One is via the actual tax that we're proposing, which would come in from the 1st of January 2025. The other way would be if we actually finally get an agreement at the OECD for a multilateral agreement between now and then, but probably by the time we brought it in, it would be a similar time frame. But just to reiterate, nothing's changed from pre-fu there.
Have you factored in that there could be tariffs as a pushback from the digital service tax?
So, yeah, so a number of other countries have had that threat as well, and the US has not followed through on that threat. Obviously, there's, that would be something we would have to cross if it occurred, but I don't believe that it will. And bear in mind, our priority here is the multilateral agreement. That's what we want, but like a lot of other countries, we've come to the conclusion that if we can't make that work, we want multinationals to pay their fair share of tax. So we're confident in this. A lot of other countries in the same position as us.
With the
There's
cost
a
of capital,
comparatively small number in there for unannounced policies. So you've still got a couple more to come in the next couple of weeks?
Well, there's still 2.5 weeks to go in the election
It's a
campaign.
small amount though, Katie, isn't it?
But you'll see it is a small amount. Yeah.
with the cost of capital rising, is it realistic to rely on borrowing as both our backup plan, but also some of the other commitments around Three Waters as well could also be affected by that?
Look, I think without getting into an extended debate about where interest rates are going to go from here, most people would be saying that they are coming off. It is slower than many would like, but they are coming off from here. And so, again, built into all of what the Treasury did is the cost of borrowing. And we've also indicated how we're dealing with that with the additional commitment we made around housing. So that's factored into the operating costs that we've got. So I think there's still no shortage of capital globally. I think most people would agree with that. There is capital out there. We've had conversations with the likes of the BlackRock one and others about people who do want to come in and support some of the initiatives we're doing. And on Three Waters or affordable water reform, I think you'll find there that the state of those entities is such that we are in a strong position to borrow. Clearly interest rates are higher than they were, but they are forecast to come down.
And if I can, sorry.
That's a slightly left field question. Are you concerned about the slowdown in China, and if it turns out to be worse than people are expecting, how much will that affect your numbers?
Well, they're the big economic forecasts that the Treasury do, and as I said at the outset today, we're not second-guessing anything that Treasury's done because we don't actually get to do that in any case. When it comes to China, it's one of the reasons why the diversification of the New Zealand economy is so important. One of the reasons why the 7 new or upgraded free trade agreements that we've done over the last 6 years are important. We must diversify who we sell our goods and services to and what those goods and services are. China will always be an important market for New Zealand, but the volatility that's present there is every reason to pursue that diversification strategy hard.
And with voting opening today, you worried that time's running out to turn your popularity around?
Overseas voting opens today. Voting for other New Zealanders is still a few days away. And we've still got a lot of water to flow under the bridge before polling day, which is still 2.5 weeks away.
And leaders debate tonight.
Yes.
Have you had any special preparations for this evening?
I have been, going back and I've been going back and reading over my notes, and I'm looking forward to tonight's debate. It'll probably be a bit different to last week's debate. It's a different format. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Given how tight the numbers are, why not just suck it up and cancel big projects like light rail, unpopular projects? Why not actually just say we need that money elsewhere?
If you look at light rail, if you look at some of those big projects, the second harbour crossing in Auckland and so on, these are longer term projects, the cost of which is actually going to be, the bulk of the cost of which is going to be some time away. We're going to continue the same approach that previous governments have taken when it comes to major infrastructure projects like that, and that we've funded instalments over a period of time. That's how we've funded big projects in the past, and that's how we'll fund those ones.
Would you be happy for light rail to be a PPP, if that's what's required?
We haven't locked down how we're going to, the preferred funding option or even the preferred, construction option yet.
So PPP is, you're not opposed to it?
Look, we haven't taken options off the table, but we're going to look for the most cost-effective option.
Just in terms of, discussing threats to these assumptions, if you hypothetically, in the next few weeks, got a call from the Director General saying this next strain of COVID-19 is terrible, just as bad as the original one, and you had to do it all again.
You're triggering him, Thomas.
I don't want to...
You just sent a shiver down my spine.
I don't want to psych you out before the debate, but
Thanks for that.
If you were given those same numbers, those same forecasts of deaths with the new variant, would you feel confident to do all of that again?
My message to New Zealanders is that whatever circumstances we face in the future, whatever phone call you get from the Director General of Health or whether it's from the Director of the Emergency Management Agency, we are in a good position to be able to support New Zealand through that, and we have a proven track record of doing that.
Can I just ask a cyclone-related question, please?
Yeah, I guess I'm the Minister, so yes.
Flood-affected residents are concerned huge piles of silt now sit on their land forever. Can you commit to more money for the silt recovery task force? They say they need a lot.
Yeah, so we've just, in the last few days, as you'll be aware, committed to an additional $10 million. That comes on top of a recent transfer of another $12 million, which comes on top of $70 million that we originally put in. When we started this exercise, we were told that the total bill would be $80 million. So clearly the cost is a great deal more than had been expected. We've found that additional money and we'll continue to look for ways to support the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, who obviously have an important role here as well. So this will take us out a little bit further than we did. We know we need to do work now before planting season, but this is a very, very large bill for which we have now contributed a significant amount more than what we even thought the total cost would be. So we put the extra money in, the extra $10 million in, the work can carry on, and we will continue to look for ways to work with others who also need to be able to support bearing the costs, including the Hawke's Bay Regional Council.